Now we're going to talk about the structure of synovial joints. This is our third classification based on structure. Remember, we talked about fibrous, then cartilaginous, and now we have synovial joints. All synovial joints can be classified as diarthrotic joints based on function because they are freely movable joints. They're called synovial joints because of the presence of a synovial membrane and a joint cavity. That's what makes them freely movable. And before we get into the specific types of synovial joints, we have to talk about the overall structure because they are more complicated than what we saw in fibrous or cartilaginous. And so structural elements that are included in synovial joints will be a joint. You'll see a joint cavity, or we can also call it a synovial cavity. This is a space between the two bones that are joined together by a synovial joint, and that space allows for free movement. And we'll see the presence of an articular capsule, which will join those bones together and help create the joint cavity that's between. So let's talk about the articular capsule first. So this is just a generic synovial joint. It's just showing you, in this case, it's showing you the distal end of the femur, proximal end of the tibia. This would be the knee joint. And this is just depicting, most of the times when you're learning synovial joints for the very first time, it's just going to, you'll see some generic structure just like this to talk about all of the structural elements. So this could be, these structures can be applied to pretty much any of the synovial joints. But we're just talking, this picture is just showing you the knee joint, or a simplified version of the knee joint rather. And so here, let's talk about the articular capsule first. And so this outermost structure, this white fibrous connective tissue, okay, this is the outer layer, the outer fibrous layer of the articular capsule. So the articular capsule is composed of this outer fibrous layer and this inner synovial membrane. Those are the two parts of the articular capsule. And so let's talk about the functions based on those two specific components. The outer fibrous layer, this is going to be made up of a dense, irregular connective tissue. So prominent collagen fibers present, resist pulling forces, strong, stable tissue. So that's going to help bind these bones together, right? Keep these bones from pulling apart, all right? The fact that it's dense, irregular connective tissue, that irregular component means that it can be vascularized. It has room for blood vessels, a nervous tissue supply, okay? So it's it's vascularized, and it resists these bones being pulled apart. So this outer layer of the articular capsule is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's vascularized, it keeps the bones from being pulled apart, and it also helps isolate the joint from the rest of the body. One of the things that the book talks about is isolating the joint from blood vessels that could be around here. And the reason for that is because if we were to have blood vessels running through this joint cavity, anytime we were standing or our knee moved, anytime this joint moved, it would compress and block off those blood vessels, potentially damaging those blood vessels. So we don't want these joint cavities to have blood vessels running through them. So this articular capsule helps isolate the joint cavity from all of the other structures that surround it. All right, so we do not see blood vessels running through the joint cavity itself, right? And I'll talk about how, so if we don't have blood vessels within the joint cavity, how do we get nutrients and oxygen, and how do we get rid of waste from the joint cavity? And that's going to be the what I'm going to talk about next is the synovial membrane. So the inner layer, this is that kind of purplish layer right along the inside of that white fibrous connective tissue. That is the synovial membrane, and it's the inner layer of the articular capsule. And if you remember, so flashback to chapter 4, I added this. We talked about true membranes. There's a synovial membrane. It lines the cavities surrounding freely movable joints, okay, those synovial joints. Here, this is our This is a flashback to Chapter 4, so you could revisit your Chapter 4 notes to see these PowerPoint slides. Here's our generic synovial joint. Here's our dense irregular connective tissue of that outer articular capsule. The inner layer, which is the synovial membrane, if you remember back to Chapter 4, we talked about how the synovial membranes are made up of a specialized loose connective tissue. Loose meaning it can be very well vascularized. And we have these modified fibroblasts called synovicites. And these modified fibroblasts will secrete synovial fluid as well as reabsorb secrete new synovial fluid and reabsorb old synovial fluid. So there's constantly this recycling of synovial fluid, new being produced, old being reabsorbed, back and forth, okay? And it's consistent in the amount of synovial fluid that gets secreted is the same amount that gets reabsorbed, because we don't want an overproduction of synovial fluid. That's bad. We also don't want to reabsorb it faster than we make it, because not having enough synovial fluid is also bad. So why is that? Well, synovial fluid does a couple of functions. So it's a thicker, like more viscous type of fluid. Think the consistency of egg whites. So it's very slippery. It's going to help lubricate. So it fills this joint cavity. So those synovicites, those modified fibroblasts, will secrete synovial fluid into the joint cavity. That thick, viscous, egg white consistency fluid, very slippery, helps lubricate the ends of these bones so that they can slide past one another. It helps reduce friction. The fact that the joint cavity is filled with a fluid also makes it a better shock absorber, right? If this were just filled with air, these bones would most likely, even though we have other structures that can help reduce friction, we would still have these bones crashing into each other. There wouldn't be as much shock absorption if this cavity was just filled with air. But the fact that it's filled with a fluid helps resist compressive forces and act as a shock absorber. Another function of the synovial fluid is that it helps nourish the tissues that make up that are found within the synovial cavity, especially this articular cartilage. So we'll talk about articular cartilage in just a second, but it's hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is not vascularized. It's avascular, so without vascular tissue. But these chondrocytes, those cells that are housed within this hyaline cartilage, need nutrients. They also need to get rid of waste. And so how do they do that if there are no blood vessels running? And we don't want blood vessels in the cavity, right? Because they'll get pinched off and damaged all the time. So how did the cells of the hyaline cartilage, those chondrocytes, get nutrients? How are they able to maintain metabolism if they don't have blood vessels nearby? Well, the synovial fluid that gets secreted by the synovial membrane also contains nutrients, and those nutrients will help maintain this articular cartilage. And then all the waste products from the chondrocytes of the articular cartilage will they'll go into the synovial fluid. And whenever that synovial fluid gets reabsorbed and recycled, that's how we eliminate waste from the joint cavity. So that's another function of the synovial fluid as well. Okay, so this is the articular capsule. It's composed of an outer fibrous layer made up of dense, irregular connective tissue. That dense, irregular connective tissue helps bind these bones together. It resists them being pulled apart, and it helps isolate the joint cavity from external structures like blood vessels from being within the joint cavity and being damaged. The inner layer of the articular capsule is this purplish, it's denoted by this purplish line. That's the synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is composed of a specialized loose connective tissue, which is highly vascularized, and modified fibroblasts, called synovicites, which secrete a synovial fluid. right, that synovial fluid then fills the joint cavity, okay? All right. Now, the synovial fluid, which is we have already kind of talked about these functions, but I'll go through it again with this slide. Remember, those synovicytes, those modified fibroblasts, secrete synovial fluid, and that synovial fluid fills the joint cavity. It has a consistency of like egg whites, so it's very slippery. So one of the big functions of synovial fluid is lubrication. It helps reduce friction between these two bones. Since this joint is freely movable, these bones are constantly gliding past one another, especially with the knee. There's compressive forces of the femur bearing down on the tibia. So the synovial fluid helps lubricate, okay, reduces friction. Transportation of nutrients and waste products. So the fact that the synovial fluid is constantly being recycled, new fluid gets produced and secreted, old fluid gets reabsorbed. We have this constant circulation of nutrients and elimination of waste products. That's a good thing because the articular cartilage, this hyaline cartilage, is avascular, doesn't have blood vessels, and there are no blood vessels running through this joint cavity. So the synovial fluid transports nutrients to the hyaline cartilage and transports waste away, okay? So that's what this transportation function means. And then also it aids, that synovial fluid aids in shock absorption because it's a thick liquid, fills this cavity, and it helps reduce compressive forces and acts as a shock absorber between these two bones. Okay, it helps distribute the stress and force between these two bones. Okay. And then the articular cartilage, which I've already talked about a little bit, but that's the third major structural element of all synovial joints. And the articular cartilage is going to be found around, so we're talking about the distal end of the femur. This is the epiphysis, and this is the epiphysis of the proximal end of the tibia. The articular cartilage is found around these epiphyses. It's this lighter blue tissue right here. All right, so articular cartilage is composed of hyaline cartilage. It's avascular, meaning it does not contain blood vessels. And so therefore it's going to require the synovial fluid that bathes it to get its nutrients and to eliminate waste into the synovial fluid. All right, so it relies on synovial fluid for oxygen, nutrients, and waste removal. Hyaline cartilage, when you learned about tissues, you should think, okay, so hyaline cartilage, it's very glassy and very smooth, and it's rigid, but also kind of flexible enough, but rigid enough to be sturdy. And so you think smooth, glassy, sturdy, kind of flexible tissue makes sense that it would line the ends of long bones that are going to be constantly moving past one another, right? So that smooth, glassy, articular cartilage also helps reduce friction and compressive forces between the two bones, okay? All right, some other components that you can find in synovial joints. So all synovial joints, you'll find an articular capsule, you're gonna find a synovial membrane, you'll find synovial fluid and articular cartilage. Some other components that you may find within more complex synovial joints or larger synovial joints, you can find some adipose tissue. Adipose tissue also helps with, compressive forces, and it adds some extra padding, especially between like really bony processes and softer tissues. You can find nerves within synovial joints. So these nerves would be more located within the articular capsule, okay? Why would we have nervous tissue in joints? Well, sensory neurons could help sense any sort of pain that you might be, pain or damage to the synovial joints. There are also some specialized sensory nerves that you find within joints that gives your central nervous system information about how the body is positioned. And we'll learn a little bit more about this when we get to the nervous system chapters, but there are sensory neurons that can help sense pain and help sense damage to joints. There are also sensory neurons that can help give our central nervous system information about how our body is oriented, like how our joints are oriented, therefore how our body is oriented within space. And then blood vessels, but again, those blood vessels would be limited to our articular capsule in the outer fibrous, that dense irregular connective tissue, and then the loose connective tissue of the synovial membrane. So this is just a larger image, just amplified a little bit, but same thing, okay? So you should be able to tell me about the structures, the structural elements of synovial joints, what tissues they're composed of, and what are their functions. All right, synovial joints, because they are freely movable, right? The presence of that joint cavity and the fact that they're freely movable, they're diarthrotic joints, means that they are going to be there. You have to sacrifice stability for more mobility, right? The more mobility you have, the less stability you're going to have. So for synovial joints, you have to have some additional stabilizing and supporting factors to help keep them together, okay? So some stabilizing, supporting factors that you find, ligaments. So there will be other ligaments like those interosseous membranes and those interosseous ligaments. You can find those around synovial joints or nearby. It helps stabilize those freely movable joints. These ligaments will be strands of dense regular connective tissue, helps bind the bones together and provides some additional strength and reinforcement. Tendons. So tendons are also bands of dense regular connective tissue. We learned about that when in the tissue chapter, when we talked about dense regular connective tissue. Where do we find them? We find that dense regular connective tissue in tendons and ligaments. But tendons connect skeletal muscles to bone, right? So it connects muscle to bone. And around these synovial joints, you will find skeletal muscles. Why? Well, in order to get movement at that synovial joint, you have to have skeletal muscles contracting. So when skeletal muscles contract, that is what provides or gets the movement at that joint to occur, all right? And these tendons that connect the skeletal muscle to the bones can also help aid in stabilizing and supporting those synovial joints that they surround, all right? So tendons can help support and stabilize synovial joints. So it says tendons cross associated joints, and it helps provide some additional stabilization. Muscle tone, what this is referring to is that your muscle tone, if you are conscious, like if you are awake and conscious, your muscles have a certain level of contractility all the time. If you completely lose your muscle tone, that means you have fainted, right? The complete loss of muscle tone means that you are unconscious and you have fainted. But if you are just awake and you are upright, you have a certain level of muscle contraction, and that's called muscle tone. And that muscle tone also helps stabilize joints, especially freely movable synovial joints. Bursae and tendon sheath. So when I'm gonna talk about what bursae are, I'm also going to talk about menisci, which surprisingly this book doesn't have, and then tendon sheaths. But I'm going to go to pictures to show you this. Here, I stole this image from another book. This is a knee joint, and the knee joint is incredibly important. Your knees are so important. They're more complex than our basic synovial joint that we just talked about, and that there are additional structural elements here besides just the articular capsule, your synovial membrane, synovial fluid, and articular cartilage, which is all present here, but we also have some additional structures. So here we see some adipose, right? Especially over here on the anterior side of the knee where we have our bony patella. It's gonna, there's a lot of force. Think about being on your knees. crawling on your knees, you're going to need some more cushion and adipose. So you see adipose present. So what bursa are? A bursa is like a little pocket of synovial fluid. The book uses the analogy of a limp balloon. So it's a slippery, fluid-filled pocket. And you find bursa in synovial joints where you have bony projections. So like here, you have your patella. And then you have our soft tissues of like your skin, essentially. And so this bursa is a pocket, a fluid-filled pocket that helps with, it's a fluid-filled sac that helps kind of reduce friction in those areas. It adds just a little bit more padding there, all right, between bony projections and soft tissues like the skin, okay? Menisci, if you've ever heard of meniscus for singular or menisci for plural, these are, and I know you've probably heard of like a torn meniscus. What does that mean? What is a meniscus? A meniscus is a fibrocartilage pad, a fibrocartilage projection where you have high amounts of compressive forces. So if you think about how often you are standing upright and that the femur is bearing down on the tibia, that's a lot of compressive forces. Just walking throughout the day, running, jumping. I mean, there's a lot of compression at this knee joint all of the time. So we need some additional help with resisting compressive forces, and we need some additional shock absorption. We need some more help with shock absorption. And that's where menisci come into play, because a meniscus is a fibrocartilage pad. When you think fibrocartilage, what should you always think? Very good shock absorber. All right, so these menisci project into the joint cavity between these bones and help with shock absorption. It also helps with weight distribution, all right? So it helps distribute weight better and it helps absorb shock. So that's what a meniscus is. It's a fibrocartilage projection into a joint cavity where you have really high amounts of compressive forces, all right? So that's what a bursa is. That's what a meniscus is. Here, this is your shoulder joint. So this would be the glenohumeral joint between the glenoid cavity of the scapula and the head of the humerus. Here we have, you see, subacromial bursa. This is where learning your anatomy of the anatomy of the bones comes into play. Acromial, like you should think the acromion process of the scapula. Subacromial means that it's below the acromion process. So what is a bursa again? It's a fluid-filled sac. It's filled with synovial fluid. It's a little pocket of synovial fluid that just helps with reducing friction, especially between bony processes within a synovial joint. So this is a bursa. This is showing you a tendon sheath. So I'm going to go back to this slide. What is a tendon sheath? It is a long bursa. Think it's like a cylindrical bursa that surrounds tendons and helps protect them as they slide across the joint. So here, this is a tendon of the biceps brachii, and it's a really long tendon. So biceps brachii is going to be further down here. This really long tendon comes up and goes over the head of the humerus and attaches up here. So it's a very long tendon, and think of how often your shoulder joint is moving. It moves a lot. So this tendon is constantly sliding over this joint, okay? And so this tendon sheath is a cylindrical bursa, a fluid-filled structure that helps with reducing friction of this tendon constantly sliding across. Think of if there wasn't a tendon sheath present here, you could very well get tendinitis very easily from just friction forces, okay? So a tendon sheath is just a cylindrical bursa, okay? It's fluid-filled bursa that helps reduce friction around a tendon that's going to be constantly sliding. So bursitis, if you've ever heard of bursitis before, itis usually means inflammation, and then now you know what bursa are, and so bursitis, it's inflammation of bursa. It can be from a traumatic event like a fall, If you just repetitive movements, this is very common in pitchers and baseball because of just the very overly repetitive movement, or inflammatory diseases that attack the bursa, all right? So if you want to read through this, I might ask a question where you have to apply structure-function relationships of the anatomy you just learned to a clinical application like bursitis. Okay, so understanding what is bursitis, inflammation of bursa. How might that affect synovial joint movement? Okay. And this, I just stole this picture from the internet to show you again. So we have bursa, a fluid-filled sac. You find bursa between bony projections and soft tissues like the skin. So here, this would be the olecranon. This is your olecranon area. That's why it's called the olecranon process, or the olecranon bursa rather. So here's the head of the ulna where you find the olecranon process, and we have this fluid-filled sac, this bursa, between this bony projection and the soft tissues of your skin, okay? And then this is just showing you if you constantly have repetitive motion in this area, then you could get bursitis or inflammation of this bursa here. Arthritis is inflammation of joints, all right? And it can result in pain because if you have inflammation of those joints, remember you have neurons or nervous tissue present in those joints, and those sensory neurons can pick up on pain. Arthritis or inflammation at joints can limit the range of movement at those joints. And the three most common types of arthritis or joint inflammation are, it's going to be osteoarthritis. This is the most common form, and think of it as just due to normal wear and tear over time, little injuries that accumulate over time, and advanced age. So as we age, our joints aren't as good at producing synovial fluid, all right? So as we age, we don't produce synovial fluid very well. Not having enough synovial fluid means that you're going to have more wear and tear on your articular cartilage. And when that articular cartilage breaks down, that's when we get arthritis. And so you can have joint stiffness or even loss of mobility at that joint. Rheumatoid arthritis is it's a less common form of arthritis, and this is due to your own immune system attacking your joints, and it destroys or breaks down that articular cartilage. And when that articular cartilage breaks down, we get inflammation and stiffness and loss of mobility. But rheumatoid arthritis is due to your own immune system targeting and fighting your joints, okay? Gouty arthritis, this is what is present in individuals who have gout. Gout is a condition in which you produce too much uric acid, or your kidneys aren't able to secrete enough uric acid in the urine. So either you make too much and your kidneys just can't handle it all, or there's something wrong with your kidneys and your kidneys have an issue with eliminating uric acid. Uric acid is a metabolic waste product from breakdown of purines, all right? Purines are present in foods, but anyways, I'm not going to ask that specific of a question, but gouty arthritis is present in individuals who have issues with eliminating uric acid. Uric acid then crystallizes and forms deposits in joints, and that can cause inflammation and limited mobility at joints as well.